Okay, hello everyone. I'll be giving you a short lesson on why Africa is like this. First of all, almost the entirety of the root of this problem can be traced to the colonial era. Yes, this came from this. The main root, rather than like normal ones where they were just being straight up racist, was how colonial administration was actually run. Because most of these were direct governments, they would just appoint a governor. So the local people had little to no experience actually running, unless you were this fellow. Oh wait, no, no, no. This one too far. Unless you were this guy. Because they were eventually given a parliament. However, it was based off of race. And it mainly had Dutch nationalism thrown in. I'm not saying that Dutch nationalism is bad, but when you're in Africa, it always has to have a sense of racism. That's also why there isn't a single African American person in this photo, I guess. But also, there at the time, imperialism was just mainly an excuse used so that each nation could vastly improve their own wealth, which leads to countries. Okay, by the way, Chad is not this bad. I just used it. That's why you don't see it as rich as it probably would have been if it was unified without European interference. And then there was the slave trade, which deprived the countries of actually some of its most strong warriors, which actually made them weaker. Because, to my perspective, I'm not sure if this is true or wait, no, just cut down. It deprived the population of a large amount of workers, and ironically, the descendants of these workers would actually become some of the first advocates for independence. And then there's now let me explain how this caused this. The infamous dictator who has no clue what he's doing. So back in this time, due to the fact they deprived the local elites, as well as the lower classes, from actually having any influence within political matters, unless of course you were a protectorate, it led to the local elites being unable to actually understand how to govern, which led to the multitude of dictators we see in Africa today. Because the ineptitude was that it caused them to view that the people were there to serve them, not the other way around. But in areas where it did, we can see why. Because immediately when decolonization happened, they deprived the people of their local elites who actually did govern by enforcing a democratic tradition upon them. In Libya, however, this wasn't true. Libya, for most of its history, was actually quite prosperous until after the post-Gaddafi stuff, but that's mainly just because of constant civil war. South Africa, the reason for why it was actually better off than most of Africa was actually due to the fact that after desegregation was enforced, African Americans could actually run for office. But also keep in mind, these guys are still around. And they're the only ones who've actually had experience running the country. So top it off with that, it leaves some room for the local African Americans to learn how to rule, so they no longer have to worry about as many issues as these countries had. As well as, if one president failed, there was always a fallback in some member of this community, but that hasn't been needed recently, and the current president, and South Africa is arguably the most democratic nation in Africa. Now, on to countries like Ethiopia. Basically, it's a monarchy. They aren't going to learn how to run the country. The local people won't learn how to run the country. It's always been the elites governing. So when the military coup happened to overthrow the king, you put a bunch of people in charge who've never actually ran the country. Guess what's going to happen? But recently, Ethiopia has taken steps in the right direction, minus some corruption, but that's common in almost all countries. And then, well, the Italians weren't actually known for being as bad as some countries. Basically, they were on par with the French. The French, they actually weren't bad at all. They were bad, but they didn't even let the local elites run at all. Britain allowed some, France didn't. Italy, I have no clue. I need to look further into that. I'll probably make a follow-up video of that. But honestly, the legacy of slavery can still be felt. But all of this has traces into slavery. Because of slavery, the African kingdoms and chiefdoms, etc., kept fighting each other rather than unifying. Because every time they trained a slave, they would get something new, like gold or money or guns. Basically, they were too focused on their own internal petty squabbles to realize what was about to happen. Here, he was actually elected democratically, ironically, believe it or not. The problem is, if the people haven't actually seen a leader and the only one who shows up claiming to defend them runs, who do you think they're going to vote for? The one person who's promising to defend them. Because in Rhodesia, it was basically white supremacists against African Americans. Not African Americans, Africans. I apologize. So who do you think the majority African population would vote for? The one African actually running. But colonization was probably actually damaged these nations more than them continuing to fight would have. Because at least then they had a single identity. Rather than a European border that wasn't even based off of their own ethnic composition. You end up with countries like, for example, you basically created a monster on the scale of Austria-Hungary if you don't even bother to look at the ethnicities. That's what's led to wars between Ethiopia and Eritrea, for example, but arguably they are actually Ethiopian. And wars within Somalia as clans fight each other. Basically, all their issues originate from colonialism. And some of them won't likely even be solved within our own lifetime. To be brutally honest. It's left too large of a footprint in the nation's past and future for any of this to be undone within a single person's lifetime. But on to actually why most of Central Africa is bad. Most of their land is actually uninhabitable due to the Saharan desert. And a few people who actually managed to live in the Sahara, not even live, just migrate through it, they have their own form of nationalism. Why pay fealty to a government that you barely even live in? It's also disrupted multiple cultures, the establishment of these governments, because most of the clans within those deserts actually functioned as their own autonomous government. It wouldn't matter if they migrate because they would carry their government with them. But when organized governments started taking over, they weren't able to move as freely. Yeah, and also, it disrupted some of the trade they would have otherwise received. Nigeria can be seen as a very good example of what to do. Rather than trying to establish an ethnic-based state, they actually bothered to live with what they had. They tried to find compromise between Christians and the Christian South and the Muslim North, and established a federal system rather than a unitary, which would empower local groups slightly. South Africa, on the other hand, most of its tribal identity was broken over time, so it can function as a modern democracy. Libya, on the other hand, the kingdom actually had a history of being united, so there wasn't much change there. Here, the only issue was the civil wars that originate from ideologies. But next, on to the Cold War. The Cold War was an unofficial proxy war between the United States and the Soviet Union. So communist uprisings would be sponsored in neutral and pro-American countries. Ethiopia tried to remain neutral but was overthrown in a communist coup, and I already went over why that was that. And then we have the American side of it, where in Libya, it wasn't because of it. But also in that, keep in mind the United Arab Republic still affects Africa. It was formed around the idea of United Arab ideology. The problem is, how do you convince the people to join you? If they're under a monarchy, you'd think that monarch will give up power. The only ones who were able to actually join together were the only two actual republics in the area, Egypt and Syria. Eventually that broke down, probably because they can't really move troops or food or equipment that easily if they're separated by like 5 countries. And also keep in mind that it was mainly Egyptian dominated, so the Syrians wouldn't likely want to stay with that. But in Egypt, they also had a lot of stuff going on. They overthrew their king before, they nationalized the canal, and then Britain and France come back to retake it. They're forced out eventually by diplomatic pressure. Militarily, they destroyed the Egyptians. But anyways, that would summarize why Africa is as bad as it is, and I hope this actually enlightened you on some issues. I'm hoping to actually redo this video in the future because I need to actually have these planned out ahead of time. But also, keep in mind that a lot of stuff about their geography and ethnic composition and resources will let you in on so much of what is actually going on. While a minority, the Dutch and British inhabitants of formerly British inhabitants of South Africa are still an outspoken minority. They're ready to actually take up the reins, but they will still, and they're one of the few they're one of the few countries that has actually an educated population. Rhodesia doesn't have that heavily educated of a population, and that's honestly probably why their economy is so bad. So thank you, and I hope that this video was actually very good. Please like and subscribe, and vote in the poll if I should do more videos like this.